They called it an accident. But the death of Gram Parsons has never stopped raising questions. He was found in a motel room near the edge of the Joshua Tree Desert, alone, frail, with no family at his side. Just hours later, his body vanished from the morgue. And then, it was illegally cremated right there in the sand, doused with gasoline, burned without a priest, without a permit. Some say it was a promise among friends. Others believe it was a way to erase the evidence. Gram had once stood beside the biggest names in music, yet offstage, he was a man broken far too soon. Orphaned of his mother at 19, dropped out of Harvard after an unsigned telegram arrived. He always kept small, folded slips of paper no one was ever allowed to read. In his final days, he wandered Joshua Tree with a mysterious envelope. That night, he was gone, and all that remained was ash. Was it a farewell, or a carefully arranged plan to keep him silent forever? Chapter 1. A wealthy childhood and unimaginable loss. It was a winter morning in 1958. There was no snow in Florida, but the air still carried a chill. Young Ingram Cecil Connor III, everyone called him Gram, sat on the front steps, knees pulled close to his chest. The door to the backyard shed closed behind his father, and a moment later, the world went quiet. Inside the house, glass clinked softly. From the kitchen came the sharp scent of liquor. Avis, Gram's mother, was still asleep, lost in the haze from the night before. When a neighbor ran over to call the police, Gram didn't understand what was happening. Minutes later, someone gently pulled him away from the steps. His father had ended his life in the shed. No note, no goodbye. The Parsons family was wealthy. They owned the vast, snivelly orange groves, acres upon acres of land, and more than enough money. There was a pool, a tennis court, and elegant dinners served under warm light. But behind those white walls were endless drinking parties and explosive arguments. Gram and his younger sister would often sit quietly in their room, listening to chairs scrape across the floor, to voices rise and then go silent. He learned to keep quiet, to smile when guests were around, even when he felt hollow inside. School friends remembered how Gram was always better dressed than anyone else, crisp shirts, polished shoes. Yet he rarely invited anyone over. Once, a friend happened to see an old, worn shirt in Gram's suitcase. It wasn't expensive, just his father's shirt, the shoulders frayed. When asked about it, Gram smiled and said, "It's to remind me who I am." He kept that shirt all through high school, until the day everything changed. In 1965, graduation day arrived. Gram wore a blue gown, ready to receive his diploma. That morning, his mother Avis never woke up. A housemaid later said she had taken a long private phone call the night before. By morning, she was found, unconscious in bed. The doctor's verdict: complications from alcohol. Avis died on the very day her son stepped into adulthood. The news came from his stepfather, Bob Parsons. The ceremony went on, but Gram stood alone in the corner of the schoolyard, his gown wrinkled. A few people shook his hand. He nodded politely. No one asked why his eyes were red. After the funeral, Gram moved in with Bob. The new house was spotless and orderly, but to Gram, it never felt like home. A relative recalled how he rarely left his room. Once, she caught him folding an envelope quickly as Bob walked in. No one knew what was inside. Another family member remembered. From that point on, Gram started meeting new friends in unusual places: bars, recording studios, strangers' parties. He always wanted to be near someone, but he never stayed for long. Those early losses left an emptiness no one could fill, and that emptiness followed him for the rest of his life, into his music, into his travels, and into love affairs that never lasted. Perhaps it was those very losses that drove him to seek connection, in places and with people that would one day lead him down a road with no way back. Chapter 2. The mysterious telegram and the decision to leave Harvard. It was the fall of 1965. Red leaves scattered across Harvard Yard. Freshman Ingram Cecil Connor III, now calling himself Gram Parsons, walked without looking at the grand historic buildings around him. Harvard to Gram was never a dream. It was more like a train station, just a place to stop for a while. His roommate later recalled how Gram was rarely in the dorm. At night, he would vanish, returning the next morning smelling of cigarettes and whiskey, sometimes with ink stains on his hands, from songs he had scribbled down somewhere. One night, Gram stepped into a small bar in Cambridge. On stage, the speakers were playing modern sounds in country and western music by Ray Charles. The piano and horns blended with that warm, rough-edged voice. Gram stood still, beer untouched in his hand. The man next to him remembered he didn't say a word, but his eyes lit up, like he'd just found something he'd been missing for a long time. Only a few months later, Gram left Harvard. The official reason, to pursue music. But a former professor said, the week before he filed his withdrawal papers, he got a telegram. Another student remembered it had no sender's name, just a few short lines of text, enough to keep Gram silent for the rest of the evening. Leaving Boston, Gram pulled together a few friends and formed the International Submarine Band. They played in Boston, then New York. The band's rented house was always crowded, music spilling from the windows. Gram, however, lived apart with his girlfriend, Nancy Ross, in a tidier apartment. He paid the rent for the whole band, a generous gesture. But as one member recalled, he helped us, but he never truly lived with us. It was like he had to keep a certain distance, like he only wanted to stand halfway inside the circle. The group signed a recording contract for Safe at Home. Gram called their style Cosmic American Music, a mix of country, R&B, and psychedelic. But before the album was even released, he had left for Los Angeles. Some said a major producer had invited him. Others claimed he followed a mysterious woman out of New York. No one knew for sure which was true. There was no farewell party, no public announcement. One day, Gram was simply gone. 3 days later, he called from California, his voice carrying the sound of laughter in the background. I've got a new place to play music, he said. I'll tell you about it later. And then he hung up. Soon after, Gram began appearing in LA's country bars, places like the Palomino and the Aces, venues where one wrong chord could get you pulled off the stage. A sound engineer remembered there were nights he'd show up to the studio very late, carrying a notebook. He'd write a few lines, tear the page out, and slip it into his pocket. No one ever got to read them. And it wasn't just once. People remember seeing him do it over and over, like he was afraid someone might find out. The disappearances, the torn pages, and never a single explanation. Was Gram chasing music, or running from something he never dared to tell anyone? Chapter 3. Turning down a tour, out of principle, or for another plan. One morning in Laurel Canyon, Keith Richards and Gram Parsons sat on the porch, a map of Europe spread out between them. Cigarette ash clung to the paper's edges. No one knew exactly what they were looking for. Only a few months earlier, Gram had joined the Byrds. Chris Hillman had introduced him as a guy who knows a little jazz piano. But it didn't take long for Gram to step out of the background. He brought in stacks of George Jones and Merle Haggard records, convincing the band to leave folk rock behind and lean into country. The result was Sweetheart of the Rodeo, a blend of country and rock touched with gospel. The public was puzzled. Sales were slow, but Gram didn't seem to care. If I don't do this, he said, who will? A South African tour was scheduled. Tickets were already booked. But the night before departure, Keith was at Laurel Canyon with Gram. A neighbor recalled, the living room lights stayed on almost until morning. They were out on the porch talking, sometimes pointing at the map. By morning, Gram announced he would not be going on the tour. Some said it was out of principle, a stand against apartheid. Others swore they heard him mention a name that night, and it wasn't South Africa. The decision stunned the band. The management company scrambled. Gram's final performance with the Byrds was at the Royal Albert Hall. After that, he simply disappeared from the Europe lineup. No farewell, no explanation. A few weeks later, he surfaced at a party in a house once owned by Peter Tork of the Monkees, now rented by Stephen Stills. In the living room, Keith Richards and Gram sat side by side, guitars passing back and forth. Whenever someone approached, their conversation shifted instantly, to the weather, to the drinks. Their closeness quickly became the stuff of rumor. Keith learned country from Gram, and Gram got a glimpse into the Stones' world. They would spend hours listening to vinyl records, jotting down scraps of lyrics. From then on, Gram's schedule changed. Recording sessions with old collaborators were canceled, replaced by sudden trips. Sometimes he'd vanish for a week, returning with a few folded pieces of paper tucked deep inside his jacket pocket, a habit he'd had for years. Fold the paper, hide it well, as if every trip began with a secret. No one knew what those papers said, and he never told. Maybe he left the Byrds for principle, or maybe for a plan drawn up late at night on a map still smelling faintly of cigarettes on a Laurel Canyon porch. Chapter 4. The Flying Burrito Brothers and the First Cracks. 1969. Los Angeles was at the height of its musical golden age. Bars glowing late into the night, recording studios running around the clock. In the middle of it all, Gram Parsons and Chris Hillman walked away from the Byrds to form a new band, the Flying Burrito Brothers. They wanted to chase the country rock dream on their own terms, without anyone telling them how it should sound. One afternoon, the group, Gram, Hillman, Sneaky Pete Kleinow, Michael Clark, and Chris Etheridge, walked into Nudi's, the famed tailor shop in San Fernando. Nudie Cohn, the tailor to the country stars, laid out bolts of vivid shimmering fabric. Gram chose a cream-colored suit embroidered with marijuana leaves, LSD tablets, and even crosses. Grinning, he said, "Just because we wear sequins doesn't mean we think we're great. It just means we think sequins are great." The photo shoot for their debut album, The Gilded Palace of Sin, followed soon after. The cover image became an instant icon, young men in dazzling suits, yet with eyes that hinted at weariness. Critics loved the album. Sales, however, were disappointing. Concerts often drew sparse crowds, and Gram began to change. He started arriving late to rehearsals, or not showing up at all. When he was there, he'd sit in a corner, open a small notebook, jot down a few lines, then tear out the page, fold it neatly, and slip it into his jacket pocket. Hillman once joked, "What are you writing?" Gram just smiled. "Private stuff," he said. The pattern kept repeating. A studio technician recalled, there were nights he'd stop in the middle of a song, pull a piece of paper from his pocket, read it, then tear it into pieces and toss it in the trash. We never knew why. Only that no one was allowed to touch it. Alongside those mysterious scraps of paper, his use of pills escalated. It wasn't just alcohol anymore. It was downers like seminal and tuinal, and even morphine. Outwardly, Gram still joked and played. But sometimes, in the middle of singing, he would leave the room and vanish for half an hour. The tension grew. After the second album, Burrito Deluxe, Hillman decided to let him go. The official reason, lack of professionalism. But someone close to the band quietly said, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Everyone could see Gram was spiraling, and there was something he wasn't willing to share with anyone. After leaving the Burrito Brothers, Gram spent more and more time in Joshua Tree. Sometimes he'd call a friend from the desert. "There's a place I need to go alone." It might be a week before he came back. Once, he returned with a wrinkled envelope tucked in his jacket pocket. He never opened it in front of anyone. A curious friend went looking after Gram, fell asleep. But inside was nothing, just a blank sheet of paper. From then on, in Los Angeles, the stories about Gram began to shift. There was less talk of new music, and more about his disappearances, the pills, and the tightly folded scraps of paper. Secrets no one had ever been able to explain. Was he writing something no one was meant to read? Or were those pages simply his way of keeping certain truths forever out of anyone else's hands? Chapter 5. The Final Days in the Desert and the Missing Envelope. Summer of 1973. The cemetery in Palmdale, California lay silent under the harsh sun. Clarence White, an extraordinary guitarist, friend, and colleague of Gram Parsons, had been struck by a car while loading equipment after a show. The funeral took place in a Catholic church, solemn, formal, and far removed from the late-night world of working musicians. There were no long farewells, no guitar sending him off. In the back row, Gram sat beside his manager and closest friend, Phil Kaufman. The two quietly slipped out before the service ended. Out in the parking lot, they opened a bottle of whiskey and leaned against the trunk of a car. Phil later recalled, "We talked about how sudden Clarence's death was. Gram told me, if I ever go first, don't let them lock me up in some funeral home. Take me to Joshua Tree, have a few drinks, and send me off there." Phil agreed. It was a pact. No paperwork, just a promise sealed with a handshake. Less than 2 months later, Gram drove his white Jaguar back to the Joshua Tree Inn. With him were his girlfriend, Margaret Fisher, and 2 friends, Michael Martin and Dale McElroy. They booked room 8, the same room Gram always chose. On September 18th, the group stopped by the Copper Room, a local bar they all knew. They drank whiskey, mixed with a few pills. Someone at a nearby table later said, Gram laughed a lot, but his eyes looked tired, like his mind was somewhere else. Late that night, they returned to the Joshua Tree Inn. Before going back to room 8, Gram and Margaret stopped at room 1, where he had met someone the day before. There, they injected morphine. According to Dale, Gram asked for a second dose, but Margaret told a different story, that it was a woman in the room who did it. No one knows which version is true. Moments later, Gram began gasping for breath. They brought him back to room 8. Ice was poured into the bathtub. The windows were thrown open. He was laid on the bed, his body growing cold. On the nightstand, among a stack of tourist brochures, lay a small folded envelope. No one opened it then. By the time the police arrived, it was gone. Phil Kaufman got the call in the early morning hours. At the scene, paramedics confirmed what he already feared. Gram Parsons was dead at 26. In those final hours, the accounts of the 4 people in that group never matched. Who gave Gram the injection? Why did no one call for help immediately? And that envelope by the bed, if it ever existed, where did it go? Phil would only say, "I knew I had to keep my promise." But was that pact truly about honoring a friend, or about making sure something else never left Joshua Tree? Chapter 6. The Cap Rock Fire, a farewell, or a cover-up. Before dawn the next morning, Gram Parsons' body was transported back to Los Angeles, prepared for transfer to New Orleans, where his stepfather, Bob Parsons, planned to hold the funeral and burial. Phil Kaufman faced 2 choices: let things proceed as planned, or keep the vow he had made beside Clarence White's coffin. He chose the latter. Phil and Michael Martin borrowed an old hearse. Dressed in white shirts and black pants, they posed as funeral home employees. At LAX, they presented papers and explained they were relocating the body to another airport at the family's request. No one asked questions. The casket holding Gram's body was loaded into the vehicle. They headed straight for the highway, driving toward the Joshua Tree Desert. In the back seat, a 5-gallon can of gasoline rolled with every turn. Along the way, they stopped at a small store. Phil bought a bottle of Jim Beam. Martin said nothing, just kept driving. By the time they reached Cap Rock, the massive boulder rising from the desert, it was fully dark. They set the casket down on the sand, poured drinks, and raised a toast. Phil struck a match. Flames roared to life, engulfing the casket in a blazing fireball visible for miles. A nearby camping group later said they saw the glow and a column of black smoke. By the time they got closer, the 2 men were gone, leaving only smoldering ashes behind. Police caught up with Phil and Martin a few days later. The court ruled they could not be charged with body theft. California law at the time had no such provision. Instead, they were fined for casket burning and ordered to pay burial expenses. But there were other accounts. Ones never entered into the official record. A friend of Bob Parsons claimed Bob wanted Gram's body returned to Louisiana for legal reasons. Under the Napoleonic Code there, he could more easily settle Gram's remaining estate. If that was true, then Phil's so-called promise wasn't just an act of friendship. It was also a way to prevent the body from ever making it to New Orleans. Another question still hangs in the air. In those final hours in room 8, a small folded envelope reportedly sat on the nightstand. When police arrived, it was gone. Some believe Phil knew about it. Others say that if it held anything important, the fire at Cap Rock may have consumed more than just a body. Phil never confirmed. He only said, "I did what Gram wanted." Amid the conflicting stories, one thing is certain. That fire turned Gram Parsons' death into one of the strangest episodes in rock history. But was it truly a farewell to a friend, or the destruction of something no one was ever meant to find? Epilogue, a musical legacy and a mystery that never closes. Today, Cap Rock has become a destination for music lovers and the simply curious. Beneath the massive stone formation, there's still a small marker with Gram Parsons' name. It isn't official, just a slab left by someone with a few dried flowers and an empty bottle of whiskey beside it. Decades have passed since the night flames rose in the desert. Gram is gone, but his music lives on. From the recordings with the Byrds and the Flying Burrito Brothers to his solo work. Major artists, from Emmylou Harris to Keith Richards, have said he changed the way they thought about country rock. But Gram's legacy isn't just in the music. It also lives in the unanswered questions. The shirt that once belonged to Tom Parsons, the one Gram had kept since he was a teenager, vanished from his hotel room in Joshua Tree. No one knows where it went. The mysterious telegram that made him leave Harvard has never been explained. The torn scraps of paper he kept tucked in his pocket until the very end. No one knows what they contained. And then there's the small, folded envelope in room 8, gone before the police arrived. Phil Kaufman has said he simply carried out Gram's final wish, to be cremated at Cap Rock. But no one other than Phil ever saw such a written request. Some believe the fire was the most fitting farewell for an artist who never wanted to be bound by ritual. Others suspect it destroyed things that, if left behind, could have changed how people saw Gram and those around him. In New Orleans, where Bob Parsons had waited for Gram's body to return, certain legal documents still remain. They show that Gram's estate at the time of his death was far from small, including publishing rights. Could that have been the reason Bob wanted the funeral in Louisiana? No one can say for sure. What is certain is that Gram's death doesn't fit any familiar pattern in rock history. It wasn't a plane crash. It wasn't a drug overdose in a luxury hotel. It was a motel room in the desert, a missing envelope, and an illegal cremation in the open wilderness. Standing at Cap Rock, looking toward the horizon, you can almost picture the glow of that fire. The desert wind still seems to carry the scent of burning lacquer and bourbon, at least in the imagination of those who know the story. Gram Parsons left this world at just 26. He left behind music that could touch the hearts of millions, and enough missing pieces to keep his story alive, not just as a musical legend, but as an unsolved mystery. Perhaps, for someone like Gram, that is the truest form of immortality. But the fire at Cap Rock, was it truly a friend's farewell, or a curtain of smoke hiding a secret we will never know?